The Way In. Season 2, Ancient Shadows. Chapter 1, The First Surprise. There have been only two people in 3 centuries who surprised me. The first was Selene Ward. The second was Mara Vale. That does not make them the same. People are often too eager to force patterns where only echoes exist. Selene was precise where Mara is instinctive. Selene searched carefully, testing the edges of things before stepping across them. Mara moves differently. She reacts before language arrives, before training can interfere, before fear has enough time to become obedience. That makes her dangerous in a way she does not yet understand. It also makes her useful. Whether that is a good thing remains uncertain. I sit alone in a room most agencies have forgotten how to find, surrounded by papers older than the programs that tried to classify them. The rain has stopped, but water still moves through the gutters outside in slow, irregular drops. A lamp burns on the desk. Beside it rests Selene's file, open again, though I know every page well enough to recite the parts not blacked out. Meridian believed Selene discovered me. That was one of their first mistakes. Selene found evidence, reports, old accounts, stories that repeated across countries and centuries wearing different names: possession, divine vision, madness, witchcraft, command hallucination. Every age believes it invents its own language for fear, but fear is not inventive. It only changes clothes. She followed the trail until it led close enough for me to notice. Then she reached. That was the first surprise. Most minds brush against the impossible and retreat from it. Selene did not. She pushed gently, almost politely, and when I answered, she did not panic. She followed the contact back toward its source with the steady curiosity of someone who had already decided reality was less important than truth. Mara did something similar. It wasn't as refined or patient, but instead stronger. I closed Selene's file and rest my hand on the cover for a moment longer than necessary. It is one thing to remember the dead. It is another to remain uncertain whether memory is all that remains of them. Meridian marked Selene Ward deceased in 3 separate archives. None contain a body. None contain a witness I trust. None contain proof. Absence is not death. I learned that long before America had a name, before Meridian, before Selene, before the first government tried to measure the unseen and convince itself measurement was the same as understanding. I was a sailor then, not a teacher, not a witness to history, not anything worth remembering. A young man with strong hands, bad judgment, and a talent for leaving places before debts or consequences could find me. I crossed the Atlantic because the old country had become too small for the kind of trouble I attracted. I thought the ocean would make me new. It did not. The ocean only delivered me to the man who would end my first life without killing me. Though man is not the right word. Not even close. Chapter 2, Saint-Domingue. I was 23 years old when I first saw Saint-Domingue. At least I believe I was 23. After enough time, dates become unreliable. Years blur together. Faces fade. Entire decades collapse into moments that feel like they happened last week. Memory was never designed for centuries. It stretches because it must, not because it should. But that day remains clear. The harbor appeared just after dawn, emerging from a blanket of mist that had followed us through the night. Men crowded the rails as the coastline came into view. Some were merchants chasing fortunes. Some were laborers desperate enough to cross an ocean for promises they knew were probably lies. Others, like me, simply had nowhere better to go. The air felt different immediately, a bit warmer and heavier. The scent of salt mixed with smoke and growing things. The old world smelled of stone and damp earth. This place smelled alive. I remember standing at the bow while the settlement grew larger in front of us. Buildings clustered near the shoreline. Ships crowded the harbor. Sailors shouted from docks already busy with the day's work. The entire colony seemed to vibrate with movement and ambition. Everyone wanted something. Whether it be money, land, power, or freedom, those desires built colonies faster than any government ever could. I spent the first 3 days exactly as any young sailor with fresh wages would, drinking, gambling, chasing trouble whenever it seemed likely to find me. Most nights ended with empty pockets and half-forgotten conversations. Most mornings began with promises to make better decisions. Of course, I never kept them. On the 4th night, I met him. The tavern sat near the edge of the harbor where sailors and merchants mixed freely after dark. The room smelled of rum, sweat, tobacco, and seawater. Music drifted from somewhere near the back. Dice rattled across wooden tables while arguments rose and fell like tides. I was losing money at cards, again. The man appeared across from me without invitation and sat down as though the seat had always belonged to him. "You play badly," he said. The accent wasn't familiar. Neither was the voice. However, it was calm, amused, and almost inviting. It didn't feel like mocking. I looked up expecting to find another drunk looking for an argument. Instead, I found someone difficult to place. His clothes were ordinary enough. Dark coat, worn boots, nothing remarkable. His face wasn't remarkable either, at least not at first glance. The kind of face people forget immediately after seeing it. And yet something felt wrong. Not so much threatening as just difficult. As though my eyes could see him clearly, but my mind struggled to hold on to the details. I blamed the rum. "You buying the next hand?" I asked. His smile widened slightly. "No." "Then mind your own business," I snarled. Instead of leaving, he reached across the table, picked up one of the cards I had discarded, and set it back in front of me. "Play that one instead," he said. Everyone at the table laughed, including the dealer. I almost told him where he could put the card. Instead, for reasons I still don't fully understand, I listened. The hand won me enough money to recover everything I had lost that evening. Then it won me more. The stranger never touched the cards again. He simply sat there drinking and watching, while fortune changed direction around me. Hours later, when the tavern began emptying into the streets, he was still there, waiting. Not impatiently, almost knowingly. I should have walked away. Most of the mistakes that define a life begin with that sentence. Instead, I bought him a drink, then another. And before sunrise, we were talking like old friends, despite the fact that I still didn't know his name. Looking back now, I think he intended that from the beginning. Not the friendship, but the conversation. Because some meetings change the direction of a life long before either person understands why. By the end of the week, we had become fixtures in each other's evenings. The days belonged to work. The harbor was all rope burns, sunburned skin, shouted orders, wet planks, and barrels heavy enough to make a man question every decision that had delivered him there. We unloaded sugar, timber, salted fish, rum, tobacco, and whatever else the colony needed to feed its appetite. The work was punishing but honest in the simple way labor can be. Your hands hurt, your back ached, your shirt dried stiff with salt and sweat. By nightfall, there was little room left inside the body for regret. The nights belonged to Julian. That was the name he gave me eventually, though even then I suspected it had been chosen for convenience rather than truth. He arrived where I was without ever appearing to search for me. Sometimes it was the tavern near the wharf. Sometimes a gambling room behind a storehouse. Sometimes the street itself, as though the town had quietly placed him in my path. At first, I liked him because he made the world more interesting. Later, I feared him for the same reason. He spoke little about himself, but he knew things about everyone else, not broad things, not guesses dressed up as wisdom. He knew the private weight people carried behind their eyes. A merchant would walk past us, and Julian would say, without looking directly at him, that the man had already decided to abandon his partner and sail north before the next accounts were settled. A sailor across the tavern would laugh too loudly at some joke, and Julian would say the man was considering putting a knife in his captain before morning. I thought he was being theatrical. Then the merchant vanished with half the account money. The sailor was found before dawn with blood on his sleeves and no memory he trusted well enough to defend himself. Julian never claimed prophecy. He never spoke of fate. If anything, he seemed irritated when I suggested he predicted events. People are not rivers, he told me one evening while we sat outside a rum house watching lanterns rock in the harbor wind. They do not flow helplessly toward the sea. They circle the same fears until one of them becomes action. And you see the action before it comes? I asked him. He looked at me then with something close to pity. No, he said. I hear the fear. I laughed because I did not know what else to do. He did not. That was the first time I began to understand that his knowing was not cleverness. It was access. I had no word for it then, no language large enough to hold the idea that a man might stand beside another and move unseen through the hidden rooms of his mind. But I saw the evidence too often to keep calling it chance. Julian knew what people wanted before they admitted it. He knew what they remembered before they spoke. He knew what they were capable of because, in ways I did not yet understand, he had already walked close enough to feel the shape of them from within. One night, drunk enough to be brave and foolish enough to think those were different things, I asked him if he could hear me too. He did not answer right away. The tavern had grown loud around us, men shouting over music, cards snapping against tables, boots scraping across the floor. Julian held his cup between both hands and looked into it as though the answer lived somewhere at the bottom. Finally he said, "Not unless I choose to." The words should have frightened me more than they did. Instead, they filled me with a terrible curiosity, because youth mistakes danger for invitation when it comes dressed as mystery. And I was very young then. Chapter 4. The Body Left Behind. The first time Julian showed me what he could do, he chose a dying man. At the time, I thought it cruel. Later, I understood it was mercy, or at least the closest thing to mercy Julian was willing to offer a man who had not yet earned the truth. The sailor's name was Baptiste. He had been crushed beneath shifting cargo when a hoist failed near the western docks, and by the time I followed Julian into the room above a warehouse where they had carried him, everyone understood he would not see morning. The place smelled of blood, wet cloth, old wood, and lamp oil. Baptiste lay on a narrow bed with his chest rising in broken, shallow movements. Two men stood near the door, speaking in whispers. A woman I assumed was his sister sat beside him, clutching his hand and praying so softly that the words seemed more like breath than language. I remember turning to Julian with anger already forming. "Why bring me here?" He stood at the foot of the bed, face calm, eyes on the dying man. "Because he has very little left to lose," he replied. Before I could ask what that meant, Baptiste opened his eyes. Only they were not his eyes anymore, not completely. The pain did not vanish from his face, but something beneath it changed. His breathing steadied. His body, broken and failing a moment before, seemed suddenly occupied by a different kind of attention. The woman beside him froze. She said his name once, then again. Baptiste looked at Julien. No, that is not accurate. Julien looked out through Baptiste. The room became impossibly still. I felt it before I understood it, a pressure under the air, as though every mind present had taken one involuntary step backward to make space for something larger. Baptiste's mouth moved, and Julien's voice came through it, quieter than before, but unmistakable. "You see the body," he said. I stumbled back so hard my shoulder struck the wall. The men near the door began muttering prayers. The woman started crying. Baptiste's hand twitched once against the blanket, then settled. His eyes remained fixed on me with a calm that did not belong to the dying. Julien's own body still stood at the foot of the bed, empty but upright. That was the part my mind refused to accept. His body remained there, breathing faintly, eyes unfocused, as though something essential had stepped away from it without asking permission. And from the bed, from the mouth of a dying sailor, Julien continued speaking. "The flesh is an anchor," he said. "Useful, limiting, temporary." I could not speak, I could barely stand. Baptiste's body lifted one hand, slowly, carefully. Not with the weakness of injury, but with the caution of someone operating unfamiliar machinery. The gesture was small, yet it did more to unmake my understanding of the world than any miracle could have. Then Julien released him. The change was immediate. Baptiste collapsed back into himself with a broken gasp, pain returning like a tide. Julien's own body blinked at the foot of the bed and inhaled sharply, as if waking from deep water. No one in that room understood what they had seen. Nor did I. Not yet. Outside, after we left the warehouse, I followed Julien into an alley slick with rain and refuse. My hands would not stop shaking. He waited for me to speak first, as if patience were another lesson. "What are you?" I asked. He looked toward the harbor, where ships rocked in the dark water beneath a sky without stars. "I am untethered," he said. I did not understand that word the way I do now. I only knew that the man beside me had stepped out of his own flesh, entered another's suffering, and returned as easily as a sailor crossing from one deck to another. And somewhere inside my fear, a door opened. Not because I wanted power. No, but for the first time in my life, death looked less like an ending than a boundary someone had learned to cross. Chapter 5. The Hills Above the Town. Sleep eluded me that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Baptiste sitting upright in that bed. I heard Julien's voice coming from another man's throat. I saw his body standing motionless beside the bed while something invisible moved elsewhere. Reason fought desperately to regain control. Was it the alcohol? Exhaustion? Maybe I was ill. Or some elaborate performance designed to fool a gullible sailor. I explored every explanation available to me. By sunrise, I believed none of them. The following day passed in a blur. I worked the docks because routine felt safer than thought. Every barrel I lifted, every rope I hauled, every shouted order from the foreman helped create the illusion that the world remained unchanged. It didn't. Once you've seen the impossible, normality becomes a performance. That evening, I found Julien waiting exactly where he said he would be, at the edge of town, beyond the last tavern, beyond the final row of scattered homes. The forest rose just ahead of us in dark green layers climbing toward the hills above the settlement. The setting sun painted everything in gold and shadow. For a moment, neither of us spoke. I studied him carefully. He looked exactly the same. The same coat, the same calm expression, the same eyes that seemed older than the face surrounding them, that somehow made everything worse. A man should not be able to step out of his own body and still appear ordinary afterward. "What happened in that room?" I finally asked. Julien started walking, and I followed. The path narrowed quickly as we entered the trees. Within minutes, the sounds of the town disappeared behind us. No more music, no more voices. Only insects, distant birds, and the occasional crack of branches beneath our boots. "You saw what happened," he said. "I saw something," I replied. "You saw me untether," he said plainly. The simplicity of the statement unsettled me. Untether. "How?" I asked, baffled by this exchange. Julian smiled faintly. "That is a better question," he said mysteriously. We continued climbing. As the forest thickened around us, twilight gathered beneath the trees long before the sun actually disappeared. Strange vines hung from branches overhead. Massive roots twisted through the earth like sleeping serpents. Eventually, I noticed something else. The silence. Not ordinary silence, intentional silence. The deeper we traveled into the hills, the fewer animals I heard. The forest felt watchful, waiting. I did not like it. "Where are we going?" I inquired. "A place I haven't visited in many years," he replied. The answer only created more questions. "Why bring me?" This time more forcefully. This time he stopped. The path opened into a small clearing surrounded by enormous trees, older than any building in Saint-Domingue. Moss-covered stones protruding from the earth. Moonlight filtered through the canopy overhead. For the first time since I met him, Julian seemed uncertain. I could see him reflecting on something, as though considering a memory rather than a decision. "When I found this place," he said quietly, "I was younger than you." I stared at him. The statement made no sense. Julian laughed softly. "See, that's exactly the problem." He stepped into the center of the clearing. "People keep trying to measure me by the wrong clock." The wind moved through the trees. Something about the place felt ancient in a way I couldn't explain. Maybe it wasn't the place that was ancient, but something in it. As though the forest itself remembered things that history had forgotten. Julian reached beneath his coat. For one brief moment I thought he might be drawing a weapon. Instead, he removed a small flask. At first glance it appeared ordinary, metal, darkened by age, small enough to fit comfortably in one hand. Yet as the moonlight touched its surface, every instinct I possessed told me it was the most important object I had ever put eyes on. Not because of its appearance, because of the way Julian held it, with reverence. Not ownership, but rather respect. The distinction mattered. Julian looked down at the flask. His expression became completely unreadable. "What is it?" I asked. The wind moved softly through the clearing. Moonlight glimmered across the dark metal surface. When he finally spoke, his voice carried none of its usual amusement. "A gift," he said. The forest seemed to grow still around us. Then he raised his eyes to mine. "The question is," he said evenly, "are you ready to become what your kind was meant to be?" He extended the flask toward me. And standing beneath those ancient trees, I understood with perfect certainty that my life was about to divide itself into two parts. Everything before this choice, and everything after it. Chapter 6. The Flask. I expected a ritual. Looking back, I am not sure why. Perhaps because every story I had ever heard about hidden knowledge involved ceremony. Priests or symbols. Sacred words spoken beneath moonlight. Human beings have always wrapped important things in performance. We seem to believe truth becomes more valuable when it arrives wearing costumes. Julian offered none of that. The flask remained extended between us, nothing more, no instructions, no warning. I looked at the object, then at him. "That's it?" The moment felt more normal than it should have given what I know now. A faint smile touched his face. "What were you expecting?" I considered several answers and discarded all of them. Finally, I took the flask. The metal felt strangely warm, not hot, not cold, as though it existed at precisely the temperature my hand expected it to be. Another detail that bothered me. I removed the cap. There was no remarkable scent, no strange vapor, nothing glowing or unnatural. The liquid inside appeared dark and ordinary beneath the moonlight. Julian watched patiently. I hesitated. What reasonable man wouldn't? In that moment, genuine fear surfaced. Not because I believed the flask contained poison, because I was beginning to suspect it contained truth. Those are often the same thing. "What happens if I drink it?" I asked, now more curious than fearful. Julian looked toward the trees. "That depends," he replied. "On what?" "On you." I hated that answer. He seemed to always converse in riddles. Then again, I was starting to suspect I hated most of his answers because they forced me to discover things myself. I raised the flask and drank. The liquid tasted unlike anything I had ever encountered. Not sweet, not bitter, not pleasant. It tasted what my mind imagined ancient should taste like. I realize how absurd that sounds. Even now, centuries later, I struggle to describe it any other way. The flavor carried memories that did not belong to me. Sun-baked stone, endless sky, rain falling on places I had never seen. For one impossible moment I felt as though I were drinking distance itself. Then it was gone. I lowered the flask, waited. Nothing happened. The clearing remained unchanged. The trees stood where they had always stood. The moon remained overhead. My body remained exactly where it had been a moment earlier. I looked at Julian. He looked back. Neither of us spoke. A minute passed, then another. Finally, I laughed. The sound came out sharper than intended. "That's it?" Julian said nothing. I laughed again, mostly from relief. Perhaps I should have been embarrassed, angry, disappointed. Instead, I felt lighter. The impossible had become ordinary again. The world made sense. There was no mystery or revelation. No secret. Just an old man with a strange flask and a talent for convincing sailors to follow him into the woods. I opened my mouth to say something else, then stopped. A distant sound drifted through the clearing. I frowned. The noise was faint, almost impossible to hear. A conversation. Two voices somewhere beyond the trees. I turned toward it. The sound sharpened immediately, closer, clearer, as though the speakers stood only a few feet away. Except they didn't. I recognized one of the voices, a fisherman from the harbor. The second belonged to his wife. I knew both of them, and they were miles away. My stomach tightened. The voices continued, not spoken aloud. I suddenly could hear their thoughts, memories, and even feel the edges of their fear. The distinction became impossible to separate. More sounds followed. Dozens of them, then hundreds. Whispers rising from every direction at once. The clearing began to spin. I pressed a hand against my chest. My heartbeat thundered beneath my ribs. Fast, too fast. The voices grew louder. Not words anymore. Awareness, fragments, pieces of lives colliding around me from impossible distances. I staggered backward. "Julian," I started. My own voice sounded strange, distant, as though someone else had spoken it. The realization struck me a second later. I could no longer feel my heartbeat. I froze. My hand remained pressed against my chest. My pulse should have been there, but it wasn't. The panic arrived immediately, pure and overwhelming. I looked up at Julian. For the first time since meeting him, There was no amusement in his expression, only understanding. Then he spoke the words that would divide my life forever. "Do not look at your body." Of course, the first thing I did was look down. Chapter 7. The Separation. Of course, the first thing I did was look down. Panic has always been stronger than wisdom. For a moment, I did not understand what I was seeing. The clearing remained exactly as it had been. The trees, the moonlight, the ancient stones buried beneath the moss. Julian standing a few paces away with the patience of a man who had already witnessed this scene many times before, and sitting on the ground beside him was me. My body rested against the base of a tree where I had no memory of moving. My head hung slightly forward. My hands lay motionless in my lap. My chest rose and fell in slow, shallow breaths. I stared. The body did not. The disconnect hit me harder than any fear I had ever known. For 23 years I had assumed I was that flesh, those hands, those eyes, that heartbeat. Now I was looking at them. From the outside. I tried to scream and nothing happened. Or perhaps something did. It is difficult to describe. There was no mouth to open, no lungs to force air through. The urge existed, but the mechanism no longer did. The realization nearly shattered me. I lurched backward. At least I thought I did. There was no movement, no sensation of legs carrying me across the clearing. Yet the distance between myself and my body increased instantly. I was simply elsewhere. The panic intensified. My body remained beneath the tree, motionless, abandoned, dead. The thought arrived with absolute certainty. Dead. I rushed toward it. Again, there was no actual motion. One moment I occupied one place, the next I occupied another. Distance no longer seemed entirely real. Intention itself had become a form of travel. I reached my body and attempted to force myself back inside. Nothing happened. The terror that followed remains difficult to describe even now. 3 centuries later, I still remember it. Not fear of pain. Not fear of death. Fear of separation. Fear that the thing I had always believed myself to be had become unreachable. I turned toward Julian. He remained calm, infuriatingly calm. "Help me." I tried to get out, but the words existed only as thought. Yet he heard them. Of course he did. His response arrived immediately, not spoken, not in the traditional sense of how the spoken word is transported on the air of vibration to the human ear, but directly within my awareness. "You are not trapped." The voice sounded exactly like his, and then again nothing like it. It carried layers beneath the words, meaning without language, understanding without explanation. I recoiled instinctively. The sensation felt intimate in a way conversation never could. "What did you do to me?" I thought. Julian smiled. The physical expression appeared almost unnecessary now. Nothing. His reply in my mind. The answer infuriated me. "I am outside my body." "Yes," he replied again. "How?" His eyes drifted toward my motionless form beneath the tree. "Because that was never you." I followed his gaze. The body looked smaller than I remembered, not weaker, smaller. A vessel, a tool, an anchor. The word surfaced from nowhere. Anchor. Suddenly I understood what he had meant at the warehouse. The flesh is an anchor. Useful. Limiting and, more importantly, temporary. The understanding did not comfort me. If anything, it made everything worse. Because the implications stretched beyond anything my mind could contain. Julian began walking through the clearing. Or rather, his body did. His awareness remained fixed on me. "Look around you," he said in my mind. Reluctantly, I did. At first, nothing seemed different. Then I noticed the light. Not moonlight. Something beneath it. Threads. Faint currents moving through the darkness. They flowed through the trees. Through the earth, through the air itself. And beyond the clearing. People. I felt them. Not physically, consciously. Hundreds of minds scattered across the settlement below. Sleeping, dreaming, arguing, drinking, loving, hating, all at once. Every one of them burning like distant lanterns in a darkness I had never known existed. I staggered. Again, movement no longer meant what it once had. The sheer scale of it threatened to overwhelm me. Julian watched quietly, waiting, allowing me to discover the truth myself. Finally, I found the question hidden beneath all the others. What am I? For the first time that night, Julian's expression softened. Not in amusement or superiority. Something closer to sympathy. Then his answer arrived. Human. The simplicity of it startled me. The response came immediately. Human, but now you are awake. And as I stared out across the countless minds glowing beyond the forest, I realized the most terrifying part of all. This wasn't a gift unique to Julian. It wasn't something he had created. It wasn't even something he owned. It had always been there, waiting, hidden inside humanity itself. I finally began to realize what being human truly meant. It wasn't what sat beneath that tree in its base physical form, but something more. Something without the construct of boundaries or limits. I was untethered from the restrictions of my own flesh. Chapter 8. The First Walk. I wish I could tell you that wonder came first. It didn't. Terror did. For all the beauty of that moment, for all the impossible truth spreading before me, I remained a frightened young sailor floating somewhere outside the boundaries of everything he understood. The settlement below burned with awareness. Hundreds of minds, hundreds of lives, each one shining differently. Some bright, some dim, some restless, some calm. And I felt them all. Not their thoughts exactly. Not yet. Their presence, their existence. The way a man standing on a hill might see lanterns scattered across a distant town. Each light represented someone. And every one of them was completely unaware they could be seen. "How are they doing that?" I asked. Julian laughed softly. The sound reached me through thought rather than air. "Doing what?" he replied with a question. I gestured helplessly toward the settlement. "Giving off an aura of light," I said. That seemed to amuse him even more. He just smiled and told me to watch. So that's what I did. One light moved through the town, a woman carrying water. Another drifted slowly through a nearby building. Someone was pacing, worried, unable to sleep. The awareness of them came naturally, like an instinct. As though some forgotten part of me had been waiting years to remember its purpose. Then I noticed something else. One of the lights felt stronger than the others, not brighter, more like different. My attention locked onto it immediately. The sensation reminded me of hearing a familiar voice in a crowded room. Julian noticed. Good. His thought conveyed to me. "What is it?" I asked him. "A doorway," he replied. I turned toward him. "A doorway to what?" His smile returned. That smile had become increasingly irritating. "Go find out." Before I could ask another question, the world vanished. Or perhaps I did. The distinction remains difficult to explain. One moment I was standing in the clearing. The next I was falling. Not through space, through awareness. The sensation resembled diving into deep water, except there was no cold and no impact. Only immersion, Suddenly I was somewhere else. A small room with a narrow bed, a single candle burning low beside the wall. The awareness struck me first. Then the thoughts. Fear, shame, regret, not mine. His. A young merchant sat alone on the edge of the bed staring at a letter clutched in trembling hands. I knew him. Not well. I had seen him near the harbor, nothing more. Yet now I felt everything, the weight pressing against his chest. The secret he had been carrying for months, the debt, the lies, the certainty that tomorrow would bring consequences he could no longer avoid. I recoiled instinctively. The connection broke. The forest returned. I found myself hovering above the clearing once more. "What was that?" I asked, almost out of breath. The question burst from me. Julian appeared unsurprised. "You touched him," he said. I was inside him, I pondered. Yes. The continued simplicity of the answers frustrated me. Have no fear, he didn't know. Most don't, he told me. I stared toward the settlement. The implications began unfolding immediately. Thousands of conversations, secrets, memories, entire lives hidden behind the walls of flesh, all accessible, all vulnerable. The realization made me uncomfortable, Julian noticed. Good, he said. There was that word again. Why is that good? I asked. I felt myself growing impatient with his one-word answers and comments. But for the first time all evening his expression became serious. Truly serious. The kind of seriousness that survives centuries. Because the day you stop feeling uncomfortable is the day you become dangerous, he said finally. The words settled heavily between us. Below, the lights of the town continued their silent movement. People living lives they believed were private. People carrying burdens nobody else could see. People completely unaware that one day others would learn to walk among those thoughts freely. Some to help. Some to control. Some simply because they could. I looked back toward Julian. For the first time since meeting him, I understood there was something he hadn't told me. Something important. This gift wasn't rare. Not as rare as I had assumed. He saw the realization forming, then nodded. Now you're asking the right questions. And somewhere beyond the hills, beyond the harbor, beyond the island itself, I felt another awareness for the first time. Distant, ancient, watching. Not just us, but everything. The sensation lasted only a moment before disappearing. But it was enough. Because suddenly I knew something with absolute certainty. Julian was not the only one. And definitely not the first. Chapter 9, the first of many. For a long time, neither of us spoke. The settlement glowed below us like a field of distant stars scattered across the earth. Hundreds of minds moved through their lives completely unaware they were being observed. A husband worrying about money he didn't have. A mother comforting a child through a fever. A merchant rehearsing lies he intended to tell at sunrise. Tiny dramas unfolding behind walls and closed doors, each person believing themselves isolated within their own thoughts. I understood then why Julian had brought me into the hills. Not to impress me, nor to recruit me. It was to show me how little I understood about the world and the people in it. The realization was humbling in a way youth rarely experiences. Only hours earlier I had believed myself reasonably intelligent, well-traveled, and experienced enough to navigate life on my own terms. Now I was floating somewhere beyond my body. Looking down at hundreds of minds I had never known existed. Aware that reality itself was far larger than I had imagined. My thoughts drifted toward the distant presence I had felt moments before. That ancient awareness. That impossible observer. It was gone now. Or perhaps it had never been there at all. Yet the feeling remained. Something vast. Something old. Watching from beyond the edges of perception. Julian noticed the direction of my attention. He always did. "What was that?" I asked. This time he didn't answer immediately. The hesitation surprised me. Throughout our friendship he had always seemed to possess an answer for everything. Now, for the first time, uncertainty entered his expression. A question for another night. The response irritated me. Then it was real, I surmised. Julian's smile returned. "I didn't say that," he said. "But you didn't deny it either." His laughter echoed through my awareness. For the first time since entering the clearing, I realized I had managed to surprise him. Only slightly. But enough. The moment passed quickly, then his attention shifted toward the settlement below. "Look carefully," he said, diverting my focus. So I did. At first nothing seemed different. Then I saw it. Another light. Faint. Far beyond the town. Different from the others. Aware. The distinction was subtle but unmistakable. The instant I noticed it, the presence vanished. Not physically, but deliberately. Like someone stepping behind a curtain after realizing they had been seen. The sensation sent a chill through me. "What was that?" I said. Julian's expression became thoughtful. "Someone else," he said matter-of-factly. The answer struck harder than I expected. Until that moment, despite everything I had witnessed, some part of me still believed this experience belonged only to us. Julian. Myself. Perhaps whatever force had created the flask. Now that illusion disappeared. "How many are there?" I asked. The question escaped before I could stop it. Julian looked toward the horizon. The moonlight reflected faintly in his eyes. "I don't know," he replied. I believed him. That may have been the most unsettling part. For all his knowledge, all his confidence, all the impossible things he had shown me, there were still questions he could not answer. "There are more than there used to be," he said quietly. "Every generation produces a few." The words stayed with me. Every generation. Not chosen, not created, born. The ability wasn't an artifact. It wasn't magic. It wasn't a gift given to humanity. It was part of humanity. Hidden. Dormant. Waiting to be awakened. Julian looked toward me again. "Most never come to be." "And the ones who do?" I asked. His expression became difficult to read. And then he said, "Their choices shape more lives than they realize." 3 centuries later, I still think about that answer. Because I have seen it happen. I have watched gifted men become tyrants. I have watched frightened people surrender their conscience for power. I have watched others dedicate entire lifetimes, trying to protect those who never knew they needed protection. I have been all of those things at one time or another. And years later, when I met Selene Ward, I finally understood why Julian had brought me into those hills. Not to teach me how to leave my body. Not to teach me how to enter another mind. Those were merely tools. The real lesson came later. Power was never the danger. Believing you knew how to use it was. And somewhere in the darkness beyond the safe houses, task forces, and forgotten government programs, Mara Vale was beginning to learn that same lesson.